In this video, we're going to look at how we can summarize large amounts of data using a pivot table. Rohan has been presented with this set of renewable energy data and asked to create a series of visualizations to tell a story about renewable energy. It's quite a lot of data. If I scroll down to the bottom, you see we've got over 20,000 records. So he can't just create a chart directly on this data. He has to somehow summarize it. He could do this with a sum-ifs calculation, but it's going to require a little bit of setup, some tricky calculations, and it's not going to be very easy to change. So we're going to look at a really powerful and easy way of doing this using a pivot table. Before we can create a pivot table, it is quite important that you have nice clean data organized into columns with no blank rows and no blank columns. You can have blank cells, but it's really important that columns containing numeric data only contain numeric data. A strong recommendation as well is that you convert your data to a table. This has two advantages. It will be easier to refer to the data when creating the pivot, but more importantly, it will make updating the pivots far more efficient. So click somewhere in your data. We're going to come to the Insert tab, click on the table icon and press Enter or click OK. We're going to give our table a name as well. And so on the Table Design ribbon on the left, we're going to call it TBLRE and press Enter. It's a good idea to go for something quite easy to type. Our data is now all set up, and we're going to come to our Insert tab again. On the far left, you'll see the Insert Pivot Table, which is what we're going to do next. Before you create a pivot table, however, you need to have a question in mind that you want to have answered. So what Rohan would like to know is, what is the breakdown of electricity capacity from renewable RE versus non-renewable non-RE technologies? We're going to answer that question with just 4 clicks. I'm going to click on the pivot table, and it's picked up my dataset automatically, which is great. And I would like to put this into a new worksheet, so I'm just going to click OK. What happened here is Excel has given us a placeholder which says, I know you want a pivot table, but what do you want this pivot table to look like? And we designed the pivot table using the field list on the right-hand side. Each of the columns from our original dataset is represented, and we just choose what data we want to see in our pivot. I would like to see my total electricity capacity, so I'm going to tick that. And you'll see it's actually summed up the electricity capacity from our raw data. But I actually want that broken down by renewable versus non-renewable. 4 clicks, too easy. Let's take a moment to see what's happening on the right-hand side. When I choose a value that contains numeric data, it automatically puts it in the values quadrant and sums it up. When I choose a column that contains non-numeric data, it automatically puts it in the rows quadrant and takes each unique value from that column and makes it a row label. As well as the field list, you will notice we get 2 new ribbons: Pivot Table Analyze and Design. On the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, we have the option to give our pivot a name, which is actually a good idea. So I'm going to click into the box and I'm going to type PVT, and this is just going to be our renewable energy, so RE, and then you can press Enter. We should probably rename the sheet as well. So I'm going to double click where it says Sheet 1, and this is going to be RE versus non-RE. We've also got a bit of a color coding system going on, so I'm going to right click on that, come to my tab color and make that blue so I can distinguish between pivots and data. Now let's create another pivot table. This time Rohan wants to see similar information but broken down by region. So back in our renewable energy worksheet, I'm going to click into the data and come to our Insert tab. If you have one of the newer versions of Excel, you may notice you've also got a recommended pivot tables option. This can be a really quick way of getting the pivot information that you want. And you see there's exactly the pivot table I was hoping to create. So I could just click on it. For practice though, and for those people who don't have the recommended pivots, I'm not going to do it that way today. I'm going to click cancel and I'm going to come back to the pivot table button. Again, we're going to do it from scratch. So same data range, but this time I want to put my pivot into an existing worksheet. I could put it in this one, but they take up a bit of space, so I'm still going to put it in its own worksheet. But I'm going to put it into capacity by region. We're going to click on that sheet. We're going to add some filters later, so we're going to leave some space and I'm going to choose cell A3. And I'm going to say OK. Very similar to last time, we're going to choose our capacity and we're going to choose our region. And there's a breakdown by region. But I would also like to see a split between the RE and the non-RE. When I select it, however, it does exactly what I said before. It automatically adds it to the rows column, and you'll see it's added it underneath the region. We can reposition it, however, so I click and drag that to above the region, which looks pretty good. Or alternatively, I can put it into the columns quadrant. So I'm going to grab the RE or non-RE and drag it into the columns. And now you see why it's called a pivot table, because you can easily pivot this information, turn the data around to see it in whichever form you need it to. Let's give this one a name as well. So coming into the name section, I'm just going to call this PVT region. And we're just going to create one last example today. This time, however, we're going to start by clicking into this sheet where we want it to go. And again, I'm going to choose A3. I'm going to come to Insert, and I'm going to choose Pivot Table. This time it knows where to put it, but it doesn't know where to get the data. Fortunately, it comes from a table. So we can just type TBLRE and press enter. So there's another way of creating the pivot. You can actually start in the location and then specify the data. For our last pivot, Rohan would like to see a breakdown of capacity, but this time by technology and year. So we are going to tick capacity and then I'm going to tick main technology. But it's hard to see what's renewable and what's non-renewable. So I'm going to grab my RE or non-RE, but this time rather than ticking, I'm going to click and drag it straight to where I want it to go. And finally, I need to see my year, but we have to be a little careful with this one. If I just tick it, because the year is actually a number, you can see it's added to my values quadrant, which is not what I want. So I'm just going to grab it from values and put it into columns. I could of course have done that directly. Now a few things before we wrap up. If I want to remove a value from my pivot table, I can unselect it or I can grab it and drop it off the pivot. So easy in, easy out. And I do actually want that, so I'll put it back in. If I click away from the pivot, both the ribbons and the field list vanish. And when I click back, of course they reappear. But because this takes up space, you may at some point decide to hit the cross and close it, and now it's gone. That's okay. To get it back, on your pivot table Analyze, on the right-hand side, you'll see an option to show the field list. And when you turn that on, it's back. So this allows you to turn on and off your field list. Finally, let's give this pivot a name. So we're going to come up to the ribbon. I'm going to call this PVT year, and there's our last pivot table. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can format our pivots and change the calculations.